Now, I got into this, what I've been working on over the past year is what I call the Nuclear Integration Project. And as many of you might know, there's an election coming and we're going to change administrations. And it will happen. I must say I'm getting a little tired of the stuff in me, but in any event, so I, having been around this a long time, this is now my 7th tour in the government, and I've been in, 5 administrations. I thought it'd be nice to start preparing for the administration. That rarely happens. And in fact, what happens towards the end of a administration, the political people, the policy people leave, and then a whole group of new people come in, and sometimes they know something about the subject, and sometimes they don't. So I thought it'd be useful to start thinking about all of the nuclear things that the Department of Energy does, and see particularly how they integrate, because one does affect the other, both programmatically and budgets and so forth. So that's all nuclear, not just nuclear weapons, of course, but nuclear waste, civilian nuclear power, all the things that go with that. All our international connections and non-proliferation and so forth. And so as I began doing that, of course, the climate change begins to rise as a very important subject for dealing with that. And so we've been moving very much in trying to understanding all the implications of nuclear power and climate change. And so this is my first opportunity to express what that is. So again, what I'm trying to do, this is not any official position, but this is the analysis that we're going to show basically to show the next administration. So we start off with this, of course, that comes off this is Thomas Edison. I point out that Thomas Edison died before the neutron was discovered. So he didn't have a chance to comment one way or another on nuclear power. But I think what we're trying to do, and what my talk will be, I guess it's probably more of the first section than the middle section, is the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that leads to our children. I think that's really what we're talking about, basically what we're talking about today. Almost all of the speakers entered into that, and so that's the perspective that I want to take today. So this is my outline. First, I'm going to talk about generally the whole idea of electricity, well-being, climate change, where that fits in, what the nuclear power effects are. And then what you're going to see, of course, is that nuclear, while it's very advantageous in terms of climate change, has some of its own issues itself. And I'm going to go through all those issues for you. Then I'm going to talk about, the last one will be my advertisement of what the Department of Energy might play in what they are playing and what they might play in the future in terms of climate change, and then do some summaries. Well, this will be the summary. First of all, nuclear power really can be, but a lot of nuclear power can really be a primary force in mitigating climate change. It's a mature technology. I'm not going to invent anything, though in fact there are inventions yet to be done. But the issue is, of course, proliferation. And that requires a collaborative effort. There's no magic technology that's going to change the proliferation concerns. And of course, we have to consider the world where we're trying to draw down nuclear weapons at the same time. But that's the same sort of collaboration with many of the same people that you're going to need to do climate change itself. So that's where I basically close the loop. And I think, again, some advertisement. I think the Department of Energy in terms of what it brings to this, can really play an important role. Okay, so this is why you need electricity. This is a statement from IAEA Director El Baradei. Other people have said, right now there is 1.6 billion people who live without electricity, and another 2.4 rely on traditional biomass. They have no access. And he mentions that places in Africa, consumption is about 50 kilowatt hours per year, which is about 6 watts. 6 watts, a lot less than a bulb. This is a curve that I'm sure many of you have seen. This Alan Pasternak put this down together. This is a plot of the Human Development Index, which goes from 0 to 1. That's a UN-sponsored metric, consists of gross domestic product, education levels, health levels, so forth, and it's put together in a metric. And he plotted it versus the annual capacity of use for various countries around the world. Let's see, I think there's a laser here. Is this, well, that's all right. What you can see is there's a lot of countries like, just not just Africa, but around the world that have like 80% of the world's population is below this. Right, okay, thanks. This is okay. India, Pakistan, Egypt, and so forth are way below this value of this 0.8% because they have very little electricity. So as we're thinking about global climate change, we also want to bring them up into the electricity. And so let's see. I now have more things that I can do with. Okay, so that's one thing. This, of course, is I think I'm maybe the third or fourth person to show this curve, so we should be familiar with it now. This is the global stabilization. This is the IPC report. And what I'll do is just to make some, I'll look at 550, okay, as the stabilization point. But as we've talked about, we could take other values as well. But that was a sort of a standard number, which would be again about twice the pre-industrial area. I'm going to use a model to get an understanding of where this is. This is the a particular model I've run by the Global Energy Technology Strategy Program. It's very comprehensive. It's been used at the IPCC. It's part of that program. It includes just about everything you can possibly think of. Let me just go back for a minute. But it's fundamentally a market model. It tries to assume that the market will choose the most economical way of doing this, and of course it does this region by region, and it has a distribution. So just something is a few cents cheaper, it doesn't mean it's out of the market. There'll be a probability distribution related to that. I do point out, however, that, and this is the group that supported this over the years, if you can get Exxon and NRDC to be supporting this model, it's a fairly fair model. The Department of Energy has supported it as well. But again, I point out, all models are wrong. Some models are useful. That was a famous statistician from the University of Wisconsin, and so we have to be a little careful about doing this. Well, this is some of the results, and again, these are not any different than you've seen earlier today. What I did was, suppose we took no nuclear at all, or any alternative sources whatsoever. This just shows rising up at the end of the century to, like 800 parts, basically parts per million. What you've seen there is the running the model to say what does it take to stabilize at 550. And I also asked them to take a look at what would happen if for some reason or other we just stopped carbon in 2010 completely. And what you see is, again, what we've heard from Jeff and other people earlier is that, it just doesn't go away, right? Well, still, even if you could do that, you'd be back to where we are about today at the end of the century. So again, that's again, we've seen those before. And so this is, again, the way this particular model works. Again, most economical sources stabilize, and you can tell it where it stabilizes, but that it essentially applies a carbon tax for all sources of carbon, and it does include carbon sequestration, all the technologies that one could think of. And this was kind of the first results. What you see is that you end up with a fair amount of nuclear, okay, and you also end up with a fair amount of wind, but of course you still have natural gas and so forth, and indeed some coal by the end of the century. Hydro pretty much the same, but this is the global emissions by sector. And of course, since we haven't tried to apply electricity, we haven't bothered to put in, this is sort of current levels of technology and estimates in terms of what the costs are. This is what it rolls out to. So there's been no plug-in hybrids, no electric cars, no hydrogen, any of the things that might very well make a major difference, as we've seen before. This is just not in the model. In fact, I would suggest maybe going along with Jeff's earlier, if you start putting those things in, you can begin to start thinking seriously lower than 550. But what you end up with, of course, is a lot of reactors, 4,000 reactors worldwide. This is about a factor of 10 more than we have now. So, what are the issues then with nuclear? But in particular, what are the pathways because the world we're talking about then is a world with thousands of nuclear reactors, if they're going to be able to make a major dent. And what would that world look like? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the nuclear landscape, to talk about safety. What about waste, repositories, nuclear weapons proliferation, major issue, and then, of course, reducing the number of nuclear weapons that we have right now. And then how do you pull it? Basically, how do you pull this all together? This is something the next president has got to deal with, in addition to all these other things we've talked about. Well, first of all, you got to recognize there's a lot of reactors that are out there already, and there's something over 400. There's about 30 or so under construction, and of course, you always got to worry about planning. But we're getting close to 800 or so reactors that people are considering. And what you see is they're spread, of course, all over the world. And now, why do you care about nuclear at all? Well, of course, the whole idea of the nucleus is that with that kind of reaction, you're getting about 1 million times more energy or more per unit mass than you get from any other source. This shows the comparison with both thermal sources and with explosive sources. That's why you have atomic bombs. The problem is, of course, and what's sometimes called the atomic dilemma, is that the industrial processes for making the material for nuclear reactors are, to first approximation, very similar to the ones you'd make for nuclear weapons. So that's the key. So you want to start thinking about nuclear in terms of the material. So I've put this together. You want to really start from the material. You can make that either bombs or reactors, and then you can take it out of the bombs and put it into the reactors. The reason we've had bombs in the past is we said, well, that's good for deterrence. And of course, the reactors, not only don't produce carbon, but they don't produce anything, mercury, cadmium, and so forth and so on, that goes in the atmosphere. And if you do that right, of course, you get peace and prosperity. On the other, we heard earlier somebody question, well, what about less wars? Well, this is part of the issue. On the other hand, you end up with spent fuel that you have to deal with, and if the material gets in the wrong hands or the bombs get in the wrong hands, we call that proliferation. And if we don't do that right, we end up with war and kind of war and disaster. Then you recycle the fuel. You can take the same material after spent fuel, recycle it, and it returns it back into this cycle. And then you have to deal, of course, with as we know, there's been a lot of nuclear waste as we do for the not just for spent nuclear fuel, but in fact for the production of those thousands of nuclear weapons which were created during the Cold War. Now, what's new? Well, the end of the Cold War has really changed the entire way we think about nuclear weapons and deterrence. Terrorism was not an issue, and there's many people, as I've gone around to talk, both at MIT and Harvard and Ted Turner, and people are very concerned about that's now become a very important issue. We deal with rogue states. North Korea, the poorest country in the world, perhaps can build a nuclear weapon. And then, of course, the thing that's driving us here today is climate change. And then there's energy, energy security. There's a, and truth is there's a lot of energy, it's just in odd places. We heard about that earlier. Much of it is in places that are fundamentally unstable, and that makes it difficult to maintain energy security. Now, what we've talked about earlier, and what I've talked about, and what we've been talking about here is this part of this whole, if you will, Gesamt concept, the whole way of looking at it. What I'd like to do then is discuss a little bit what some of the other parts of that curve are, or that picture is, because that's important as well. Safety first. This is a list. This is a group of cumulative reactor years, and what you see, there's been over 10,000 reactor years so far. There's been 2 major accidents: 3 Mile Island and in Chernobyl. I can discuss, we think we understand very well why they happened. This is the for the modern plant designs. These are the specifications that they're all being given. What you see is they're about 10 to the 7th or so expected major core reactors per year. Again, there's very complicated calculations that go into that, but there's a fair amount of experience, so we understand what's happening. If you put that together for 1,000 reactors, you're talking about 1 major accident every 10 years. Now, I'm not suggesting that I know how to do, or people know how, but it's the level of safety, and much of these, again, are passive safety systems that people are thinking about, so that they're not ignoring in any way the safety concerns that one might have for these reactors.
10,000 years, 1 MCD every 10,000.
Yeah, what did I say?
You said 10, so
10,000 years, sorry about that. Glad you know. Yeah, I wouldn't want to. No, that's right. Well, what's a factor of 1,000 among friends? That's right. Okay. Now the second issue, and the second issue is, gee, what do we do with all this waste? Well, each gigawatt year, that means every major plant produces about, and this is a standard plant that we have in the country, about 20 tons of spent fuel. About 19 tons of that is uranium, something less than a ton of fission products. That's the real waste that can be never used again. 0.2 of a ton, 200 kilograms of plutonium, and another 0.02 tons, and 20 kilograms of minor actinides, and you have to deal with that. We put those right now in 2 dry cask storage containers. That's what we're doing now. We've got a lot of experience with them. They're safe. They cost about $1 million in operation apiece, which ends up being about 0.02 cents per kilowatt hour. Now compare that, 20 tons, of course, the same of coal would produce 7 to 8 million tons of CO2 put up in the atmosphere. And of course, we know where that is. That's in the atmosphere, everywhere. And it mixes and goes over the world. So that's the level. Now, what do we do with that? What happens with that fuel? This is a kind of a complicated curve. What it's producing is, I don't know how well you can see it, but it says this is the relative toxicity. And the specification is that in some particular time, it has to go back to the same way it was, like the same uranium that it came out of the ground before it was enriched or put in a reactor or whatever. Now, if you just take this whole dry cask and just let it sit there, it'll take 300,000 years or so, okay, to get, and that's the Yucca Mountain issue, to get there, okay? But we know where it is. But that's a long time. So people are saying, well, perhaps, and this is for example, the French approach. They said, well, let's get rid of the plutonium. Well, if you get the plutonium, you're down to a couple thousand years. And you say, well, let's get rid of the plutonium and the minor actinides, recycle those, burn those, because they can be burned. Recycling is very good. You can get the thing down to several hundred years. That's basically the story. But do we want to recycle? Well, remember where I showed you recycling, that puts you back into material, and you have to be careful about that because you don't want to then be putting more plutonium that can be used for weapons. You want to be able to reburn that. So that's basically what that issue comes from. But these strategies that you think of that people have talked about really get to this point of intergenerational fairness, because these things are going to last a long time. Does that mean I've talked for 20 minutes or I've got 20 minutes to go? Both? Correct. That's the half, right. Yeah, I was in Moscow on one of these things, and the temperature there was, minus 40, was like minus 40 degrees. And people said, well, is that Fahrenheit or centigrade? The answer is both. So the whole idea of where people are coming to, what do I do with these waste repositories? I mean, this material is going to last for a very long time, and it's dangerous for a long time, even 300 or 400 years. So how do I develop a strategy that provides choice for these people who are many generations away, but doesn't preclude things? It's a very interesting issue. How do I decide what they're doing? And in fact, truth is, it's the same issue we're dealing with climate change. I mean, don't we have to make choices now that are going to affect people 100 years, very much longer? So how do you basically deal with that? Well, there's a number of strategies that people have developed on this. And the first one is, look, we're going to do this on-site interim storage. That's what we're doing now. It's safe, it's secure, it's very, very inexpensive, but the utilities say, look, we don't want to have to deal with this, take it off. Okay, so they can say, well, look, where we've come up with is in fact, is that the strategy is going to be monitored, retrievable storage for several hundred years. So we'll move it off, we'll put it into a mountain, like Yucca Mountain, but we want to be sure for the first 300 or 400 years that we can take it out again in case there are issues or something, we can use it. And then we want to be able to put it away forever. Okay, so that's basically storage number one. People have said, well, we've had problems with that, as you know, in Yucca Mountain. I think that's not too far away from here, you understand. We can talk more about that later if you want, but then you say, well, let's just take the on-site interim storage and move to off-site interim storage. Could be at Yucca Mountain. Of course, the difficulty with that right now, it's against the law, okay, but there's no physical reason why you can't do that. And then in turn, move that into geological storage. The other approach, of course, is to say, well, look, if we can do so much better in terms of long times, let's go ahead and try to develop a recycling approach that gets rid of this long-term stuff, burns it up, it lasts for a long period of time, but still put that in a long way. That's essentially what the French, basically what the French approach has done. And then again, reprocess that material, recycle that material, and then go into geological storage. Every one of these strategies has a geological storage associated with that. We're going to put this stuff away forever, so people don't have to deal with it. We actually have developed one in this country for that, and not for all these kinds of waste, but for the minor actinized, or what's called the transuranic waste. It's in New Mexico. It's called the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. It's in a large salt dome. We move stuff all the time into that. It's been working now for few years. It works fine. And you put it in there, and it's gone. Okay, I mean, it is very difficult. You'd have to remine it to make it monitored retrieval. It works very well. Very good, very good safety record, and we can talk more about that with. So we've actually done it in this country. We've gotten to serious geological storage. Now, so we've taken care of or at least I've discussed the safety problem. Okay, the waste problem, but there still remains the international, the non-proliferation. And there is no silver bullet there. There's no way of sort of making a system that is so perfect that nobody could ever say, well, I can't get at the material. Or they could do it some other way. I mean, even if you invented such a system. So it really does require international cooperation. And people have talked about it now. This is an idea, frankly, that came out right at the beginning with the Atchison-Lillian report, but it's now becoming much more popular. This is, again, this is a statement that Director General El Baradei said back in 2003, saying, look, again, we want to restrict the people who get that kind of material, but we want to be able to provide them with the reactors when they want to. And he suggested some sort of a multinational approach to that. This is now the president back in 2004 said, look, He wasn't talking about a multilateral case, but he said the same thing, because that material, the reprocessing and the enrichment can be used for making nuclear weapons as well as nuclear material. We should be able to restrict that, but ensure that those people who want to have reactors have complete access to that material. That came out of then that was all put together then. This is the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership Program, which he announced in January of '06. Says, look, we want to build more plants. We want to worry about the waste. We want to worry about the concerns about proliferation, but we have to do this as a partnership. It cannot be done by one country alone. Certainly we can't do it, and indeed we want to deploy and do the R&D and of the types of advanced reactors, if you will, that will make proliferation more difficult, but also help solve that waste problem that we've talked about before. And now these are the principles that came out of that discussion. Again, everything we've said here. In particular, you'll notice it says, gee, we want to eliminate the stocks of separated plutonium, because separated plutonium is a very dangerous material that can be used to create nuclear weapons. So we want to eliminate those stocks around the world. As of last February, the last one was signed, we've got now 21 countries have signed up to that level of principles. And what's interesting, I don't know whether you can read the list, but this is a very wide list, not just those countries like the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and so forth, that have major nuclear establishments, but also countries in Africa, throughout Europe, some in Asia, South Korea, and so forth, Senegal, and so forth, that are that recognize this as a part of their future as well. And indeed, the global nuclear enterprise, as is rich with, people have recognized this over time, is rich with international organizations. Of course, the IAEA is there for the 144 countries have signed up on that. There's a subset of that, 28 are working on reactors. There's another group, as I say, who are in the collective R&D. The World Association of Nuclear Operators are those that, as an organization that came into being really after 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, to really share best practices and operatings and and safety. Very effective organization, and so forth and so on. So this is talking about cooperative international cooperation in the nuclear business. Of course, is not something that's new at all. It was built into the system to start out with. Now, there's one more issue we haven't talked about. But in the nuclear business, I think you should, is how do you reduce the nuclear weapons? Because that's an important issue. These are just four statements from the president. Has said, first of all, starting in February, he's committed to the lowest number of nuclear weapons. The Moscow Treaty said we're going to reduce and limit them to strategic warheads. Again, the posture review said we're going to reduce our nuclear arsenal. And then last December, the president announced a significant reduction. So clearly, nuclear weapons are going down in this country, and we believe and we hope that they'll be going down similarly around the world. So how do you tie all this together? Well, first of all, look, we're talking about fewer nuclear weapons. That's the nuclear posture. Article 6 commits us to do that. At the same time, we want to have a lot more nuclear power. Again, primarily for climate change, but other reasons as well. My friend George Shultz keeps reminding me that, and said President Reagan said we really should have zero, and there's a lot of discussion about going to zero as well. This started really with President Bush's father when he stopped production of all new nuclear weapons, and reducing things. Well, this will give us what happens. This gives us all more excess. What am I going to do with all those excess weapons material? Well, the first thing we know is we can burn that in reactors. Now, in most places, I could have said, on average in this country, 20% of our electricity is generated by nuclear, but 20% of the fuel of that 20% comes from Russian nuclear weapons that we have dismantled, made into fuel, and then put into our electrical. But I can't do that in Utah because you use all coal here. So that's a lot more nuclear power. We talked about that, but then we really need, if we're going to do that, an effective non-proliferation regime, and that's really, we have to control the material. And indeed, part of controlling the material is this whole idea of fuel services, that you don't tell people they can't have, enrich or whatever, but you sort of make it economical for them to be able to first lease the fuel, which means you give them the fuel, and when you're all done, you basically take it back. That's the essence of what those regimes are. Well, that's where, of course, President Carter and President Ford really got hung up in terms of stopping nuclear in this country, because they were very concerned about the non-proliferation perspective. Well, you put all that together, you get a more stable international political regime, and you could add to that the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And of course, if you do that, you end up with fewer nuclear weapons and basically keep that circle going. And we've heard all this before, of course. That really was the essence of the President Eisenhower's Adams for Peace speech back in 1953. Well, the last issue, and again, this is really completely unvetted in terms of within the department, and of course, nobody here will tell anybody back there, right, what I'm doing, but if you really think about the department, what the role of the Department of Energy in this, we participate in the climate change work. We do Livermore, for example, does a lot of the work on the IPCC modeling the atmosphere. Los Alamos does a lot of the work in modeling the work on the oceans. But there's a lot of assets within the department in terms of sensing, in terms of remote sensing, in terms of analysis, and in terms of the modeling. We have most of the really largest computers in the world who do this type of modeling are done basically within the models. And then, of course, it isn't one thing just to assess it, but then you also have to do something about it. And of course, that's what we're talking about today. And not only do we deal with nuclear energy, but I think you'll probably hear more about this. We do a fair amount of the research, perhaps not as much as we could in all the alternative energy sources, conservation research, carbon, and so forth and so on. So the Department of Energy, frankly, is well set up to move in this. I just want to point out trying to analyze where the department is going. I just asked, there are 17 laboratories. There's a total of 12,000 or more PhDs at any given time. We have 25,000 visiting scientists from all over the world basically coming to these places. What I try to do is describe where those, where are those scientists working. Okay, now, some of them are working in weapons laboratories, many of them are working in weapons laboratories. A lot of them are, are a lot less in the laboratories that are, whose mission is really in terms of either fossil energy, environment, or, efficiency and renewable and so forth. But, what have I told you earlier? Gee, the weapons program, we're reducing the number of weapons. We're increasing the work in nuclear energy and other forms of energy as well. So part of what we've got to do, and I think Lincoln, that was part of, in a sense, is that we've got to be able to think about how do we change our research portfolio, basically within the department. So let me summarize again where we are, and then we'll have a few minutes, I think, left for questions. One, if nuclear is going to play a role in mitigating climate change, you need a lot of it. But there's a lot of it all around the world. The technology really is mature. In the number I showed you, this was no, magic. This was based on essentially commercial available technology now, and essentially we don't need, cold fusion or anything like that to make that happen. That is available now. But there are, there certainly are, safety is always first and always an issue. Waste, I think, is an issue, though my judgment is frankly far more of a political issue than a technical issue. We have a number of strategies, I think, that are being used all around the world, and I think used effectively, in fact, used in this country as well. But I think the big one is non-proliferation. How do you, in fact, maintain that? And I think the answer to that is, in fact, international collaboration, and I would suggest to you that it's the same sort of international collaboration that you're going to need for climate change. I mean, where is the problem? Yes, we can do a lot, but as other speakers have said, this is China, this is India, this is Indonesia, these are all these other countries as well, and they are intimately involved in terms of where you're dealing with non-proliferation and nuclear power as well. So with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
So I think we have time for 3 questions and then maybe a brief announcement before the break.
In the back, please. It seems that strong international collaboration for both climate control and nuclear energy is eroded by the maldistribution of access to world resources between first and third world countries. Does your strategy not also imply the need for a major distributional policy with respect to access to world resources in order to maintain the stability out of which the kind of strong international cooperation that you mentioned might sustain itself through long periods of time?
The answer is yes. No, and they're very much the same sort, very much the same sort of thing. The difference in the nuclear in terms of the resources is that it's so much concentrated. All right, it's that factor of 1,000,000 again. I don't have to transport it. Once I can store a lot of it in one area, and so then I necessarily have to in fossil resources. On the other hand, it's not, and both of them are essentially, sort of commodities. But the first approximation, the answer is yes, you have to, that is a very important issue.
Yeah, I have a question about the cost of building nuclear power plants and operating them, and also you mentioned reprocessing of the waste and what the cost of that is.
What's the question? What is the cost?
What are the costs?
Yeah. Well, you saw Warren showed that is that actually when you look at the cost in this country, all right, if you look at the total, the operating, the reactors right now are operating in terms of cents per kilowatt hour are extraordinarily good. This is our evidence that what the issue is, well, there are plants that have all been built some time ago, and the capital costs are gone. There is uncertainty about the costs of building those plants. However, while we haven't built them in this country in a number of years, the Japanese have built them. The French have built them. Those costs are considerably, not what we ended up paying for. Warren made a good point, is that part of the reason the costs are so high is there's so much on regulatory uncertainty. Is it going to be 10 years? Is it going to be 5 years? Is it going to be 4 years? That's part of, in the Energy Policy Act, they were providing insurance for those companies that start, and then if it isn't their fault, if it's just, they can get that money responded. There's been 3 new licenses, but we'll see. Okay, because it's can you drive those capital costs down to the point that it's viable? Again, in the models I've shown that they were not, they were using essentially the basically current costs, but that's clearly going to be an issue.
And I think we have one last question over here.
I want to ask what steps are being currently taken to avoid terrorism in the nuclear plants. Sorry.
Yeah,
Well-
the question was what steps are being taken to avoid, terrorists attacking nuclear plants. I can't tell you that. You might be a terrorist. Yeah, but indeed there are a lot of obviously not just in this country, but basically around the world. Intrinsically, they're a difficult target. You just can't walk into a plant. Many of the things that people have done a lot of analysis on what happens if an airplane crashes in. That was a lot of the concerns were, for safety perspective, those are very big, thick concrete structures. But that is it's not a trivial problem, but people are working on it, basically working on it very hard. I'm willing to stay here, but that guy who's looking forward to more sex was waving at me to tell me to get off. I don't know why he'd want to do that.